Hello, welcome to Night Clerk Radio, episode 110, where we are going to have a dungeon synth dance party as we attempt to decryptify, I don't know if that's a word, a message that was left in our planning doc. So we have a little Google Doc where we jot down ideas, associated links, stuff we want to talk about, so you don't lose track of ideas, right? Mm-hmm. And there's just one that was sitting there, just dungeon synth and D&B. Had no links associated with it because sometimes, Bandcamp will make here's 5 albums around some niche or something, and we'll talk about that or expand on that or whatever. There's no links. None of us could remember adding it. None of us knew exactly what it was in reference to, if it was inspired by an album or anything. So that has spawned this whole topic episode today of dungeon synth with drums, dungeon synth with a higher tempo feel in those drums, akin to like D&B, and just what it would mean to blend those genres. Because if you do go to Bandcamp, now Bandcamp tags are a mess because they're self-assigned, so they're generally pretty close, but a lot of times people will put like additional SEO things in there, right?
Yeah, a lot of them are like regions or cities, just like wherever they happen to be located, or just made up terms that no one else.
Yeah, or just I'm going to call, no matter what I do, I'm going to say it's vaporwave and synthwave and shitwave just to bump up exposure.
Electronic.
That's fine. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But there is stuff that is tagged as both dungeon synth and D&B. There's stuff that's tagged as dungeon step, which we'll talk about. There's dungeon breakcore, and I don't know. I guess I just wanted to get into all these possible discussions around genre combining, especially fairly disparate genres that have maybe very different histories of how they came about and how they would overlap and mix and some examples. So I think there's going to be I'm going to try to remember to slip in a sample or two, but no guarantees. But everything that we're talking about, a handful of albums that kind of were at least interesting to us, are going to be in the show notes if you want to check out the associated listening.
Yeah. I have a theory about how that entry got on our planning doc. The album I remember getting me into drum and bass as a genre of music is called The Dungeon Master's Guide. It's by an artist named Diesel Boy, and I bought it back when you bought CDs. And I was like, holy shit, this rips. And I listened to it many, many times. And of course, the music is just drum and bass. It has samples from the Resident Evil movie. It has nothing to do with, there's a couple like fantastic sort of like opening elements in it, but like there's a little opening little monologue about the Dungeon Master's Guide. But like, that's it. Like, it's just drum and bass. I'm like, oh wow, this whole music is pretty cool. It's not what we would, it's not like this synthesis of dungeon synth and drum and bass, but like dungeon synth was so underground back like in the mid 2000s. So maybe it was that, but I don't know. Anyways, Diesel Boys, the Dungeon Master's Guide is a pretty good album if you like drum and bass. So I would check that out.
Okay. That's probably it. And that's probably, you're the one that actually put the bit of text in there. But I think before we talk about any specific albums, the question to me is, typically we think of some genres are just modifiers. So I'm going to go to visual media. So we're talking about movies for a second, right? So like a lot of times a genre can be a modifier, like sci-fi horror, sci-fi action, right? Sci-fi drama. So sci-fi is sort of this modifier. And I was wondering, I guess, can you do the same thing with dungeon synth? Because sometimes that sci-fi modification can be fairly lazy. Like it's just a slasher flick, but they're on a spaceship instead of a house. But otherwise it's not really science fiction-y other than the one little aspect of the setting. So I was wondering, like, to you, how much of the theming of dungeon synth has to come through for like it to feel like dungeon synth to you as a listener? Because, genre, of course, is about setting audience expectations, about like marketing, kind of letting people know what they're in for. It doesn't have to be this perfectly prescriptive label. It's just designed to kind of guide the consumer of whatever piece of media that is, kind of in terms of gauging expectation. Because that's one thing I was thinking about. In a sense, I consider those genres like thematically so different because dungeon synth is so rooted in like this fantasy, this past that never was, this medieval and prior. And it happens to be sort of through material conditions, like in the 70s and 80s of these early black metal bands, which we've talked about in previous Dungeon Synth episodes, that they used synths as their side instrument because it was a side project for somebody in like a metal band and they couldn't go get a bunch of like lutes and stuff. So they did it on their synth. So it just feels so disconnected, but totally works in all of the albums that are in the listening list in the show notes.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here because one thing, Dungeon Synth is one of the most customizable genres of music I've seen or know of because, not too long ago, a month or two ago, I found this one video. It's like 50 Dungeon Synth subgenres, like subgenres of subgenres. And it's like a 20-minute video, but they go through all like 50 of them. And there's, mushroom synth and there's dino synth and there's like all of these things. And I think it's all rooted in the synthesizer because like Dungeon Synth as a genre is about like fantasy, something that was never existent. And so it has to use an instrument that is not based in reality. It's simulating, it's creating sounds from, nothing, unlike, like actual instruments. So even though it seems like it's medieval, it has to be a synthesizer. Otherwise it wouldn't be, so I think there's this element of linking synthesizers to fantasy, to the impossible, the things that aren't real. And I mean, there's also this connection of like using synthesizers to score speculative genre movies. Yeah, like sci-fi and fantasy and horror, mainly because of budgetary reasons, but it also became like you could kind of emulate a full orchestra with a single keyboard, right? And
yeah, you get pretty close.
Yeah. And so like, and also video games too, which are all, and so like this became like this cultural link between the sound of the synthesizer and the sound of fantasy, of imagination. And so I think there's something there in there. And so then you look at it the opposite realm. Synthesizer is also the instrument of the club, of EDM, of dance music, because it can have these scientifically precise beats that, no human drummer can ever meet. And you can go faster and faster and faster and program in like a perfect, build up, drop, and then just the entire, progression of a good, night at the club. It's about the duality of the synthesizer. It's fantasy and it's also the club. And so I think that's sort of the intersection here. But yeah.
Yeah, that is sort of interesting because that sort of moves towards what I was thinking of in terms of them being slightly disparate, is that I agree that, of course, budget, material conditions, like we said, kind of encoded the synthesizer as this fantasy thing. It can do stuff that no other instrument can do, cheaper, better, in quotes, whatever. But I always thought of like the approach to electronic music in the 90s. I don't really know much about it, so this is just impressions as an outsider, but being a little more future looking, which is where like the tension comes in of like, I'm going to use this tool to like examine a past that never was versus I'm going to use this tool to create like a future of music that couldn't exist otherwise.
Yeah.
Especially like, I think there's a lot of, scare in the 90s about, starting to replace musicians and stuff. A lot of the same sort of scare now with like being replaced by AI and stuff of like the machines are coming for your jobs. I think it was Anthony Jackson, who was very famous jazz bassist. I think he gave an interview in like the early 90s where he's like, if a computer can ever outplay me, that's the end. I'm done with this life. Like basically like I'm going to die. Because there was some of that like, well, why would people pay your studio fees if they can just program a bass line into a computer? And it was, sort of this early debate about replacing musicians, which of course hasn't happened yet in the same way.
Yeah.
But it's just interesting because I feel like they're genres that are looking in different directions, but you can make it work. I don't know if that's because you strip one of the two from their context and you have to either do the back looking dungeon synth, but use modern synth techniques, which is one of the things a lot of these albums do. They have more like dubstep adjacent synths or like kind of staccato trap-ish drums or like more arpeggiators than maybe the original like dungeon synth of the 80s and 90s had access to.
Yeah.
But then in like that fantasy realm, or you kind of have the fantasy aspect be a little more tongue-in-cheek and pushed aside and just go hard on the pure D&B, which is I think what like Mesolithic sound system kind of does.
Yeah, with some like metal
Yeah.
as well. You have an excellent point when talking about like the EDM music being very future forward looking. Just scanning these albums like on the breakcore, just drum and bass in general. That's one of the things I did was just look at the tags on Bandcamp to see like how they were themed, and almost all of them were there's a lot. Yeah, it was very future looking, very very slick, and there weren't many that had like a fantasy theme to it. I thought there would be some. There is also this element of video games too, sort of also bringing bridging this gap, because there's a lot of atmospheric drum and bass and like breakcore that really got established, I think, or like as video game music, right? And people associate video games with like fantasy now, MMOs and dungeon crawling games and like
D&D.
Yeah. And we even have like dungeon crawling games that are like ostensibly in a video game, like .hack and all these other like, you're playing a person in a world who plays a video game, and you get pulled into the video game, like the isekai stuff. And it's like, and a lot of those games have like, you got to have exciting battle music. Can't just have ponderous, slow, atmospheric ambient for the entire game. You need to rev the players up to get them excited to go kill those monsters. So yeah, a lot of it is like the overall trend is being like material conditions leading to these unions, and then they get established in the culture as like, oh, this is what this sounds like, and because and it's not like anyone's grand design. It's just like, well, it just kind of happened. Like cheap synthesizers can make a good sound for slasher movie, and so we think of it as for this, and we or for a fantasy movie,
Yeah, that's interesting. Like kind of the, it's still very fluid, but that little moments of solidification of like media language of my movie's low budget, so it has a synthesizer soundtrack.
Yeah, like I've started seeing these mixes on YouTube that use video game footage from like fantasy games like Zelda or World of Warcraft, but it's like atmospheric breaks and atmospheric drum and B or breakcore while you grind monsters and outlands. Like
is that the one that you linked in our cast chats?
Yeah,
atmospheric breaks.
Yeah,
I'll make sure that's in the show notes.
Yeah, that's using Zelda game footage, but like that's one of the perennial things for making a mix for YouTube is like having visuals to it, so it's not just a static album cover. And guess what? You could record a lot of video game footage pretty easily.
Yes.
Yeah.
Especially if you I don't know, maybe they didn't even record it themselves. Also, it's tagged as hashtag nostalgia.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's like, again, this whole nostalgia cycle for the PS1, PS2 era games is really popping off, as we've talked about.
GameCube Zeldas. I'm looking at this thumbnail. Is that from Wind Waker?
I think so.
Yeah. That's about 20 years.
Yes.
Reasonable. It's reasonable for your nostalgia cycle. Okay, so do we want to talk about some of these albums specifically? Do you have other topic thoughts? Because a lot of these like bridges are connecting disparate mediums, right? So like video games with D&B and this sort of fantasy and D&B, which is interesting.
Yeah.
But we did find a few albums tagged on Bandcamp that actually do this musically, bring these elements together. So really not in any order, but the first one I found that really did exactly what I was expecting to find. Actually, for some reason, I expected to find a lot of this.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's just because I've convinced myself so many times on the show that like, oh, just everyone makes so much of everything anymore. You can go find it. But the first one is Mesolithic Sound System, the eponymous album. It's the name of the album, name of the project, released by Poppet, who is a big name in dungeon synth and associated genres out of New York. And yeah, this is exactly what I thought, which is like, they even call it like a funny amen break heavy atmospheric D&B album. But it's sort of rooted, in this Mesolithic caveman. It's a very crunchy album cover of a bunch of guys around like a Stonehenge type structure, just jamming just at the Stonehenge rave.
Yeah, exactly. In rave.
And I thought it was really fun. And it is a little more like tongue-in-cheek party album.
Oh, it was released on April 1st, 2022.
Yeah. It's an April 1st release from a couple of years ago. I don't know, like it could be an April 1st release and still totally work.
Yeah, it does.
So why don't, before we talk about it, why don't I play a little bit from here, since I said I would try to remember to put samples in. So that's a little bit from track 2, which is Esoteric Exegesis. Choral, like synth choral. I'm in breakish, breakish D&B drums. It's exactly what's on the, as advertised.
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of club music, a lot of EDM music has this like, slower kind of anticipatory build up. And then there's the drop. And then, it goes nuts. Like that's the formula, right? And so like one thing I've noticed on like, just in general, not just specifically this album, is use dungeon synth for like the anticipatory like build up and then like switch into the EDM after the drop. And it works. I like it. Yeah.
Yeah, it totally does. And this album also has like some metal elements, like the last track, which is Mesolithic Death Shroud, is a little more like synth metal.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting. But to go back to your point of dungeon synth as the drop or dungeon synth as the build up, I actually think the best example of that, of the albums that we listen to, is Buxkrug. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but it's okay because their Bandcamp says you can't pronounce my name, but I love you anyway. So Buxkrug, Buxkrug, whatever. The Dungeon Steps, which is tagged as Dungeon Step, reference to dubstep or other, house step music. And this one, I think Long Con's what you're talking about, where the first few tracks are like very conventional dungeon synth. Like it sounds like just a well put together dungeon synth album for the first 2 tracks. And then there's like starts to be some drums towards the end. And they're a little different because typically in dungeon synth, when you have drums, they tend to be like tribal or fife or marching. Whereas this comes in with like a bit more of like a hip hop drum beat.
Yeah.
And then goes into, as advertised, more steps type drumming, and synth effects. And then more like trap drumming and like house-ish drumming. I don't know enough about EDM to really know all my specific subgenre terms, but it goes.
Yeah, I mess those up too, and I listen to it all the time.
So just correct me in the comments. It's fine. Yeah. But you'll know what I mean if you listen to the album, where it goes through, this transition from like traditional dungeon synth into all of these different synthesizer techniques, but still in that dungeon synth framework. I think it's another really good example of blending of those genres.
Yeah. There's a few albums on Bandcamp labeled as Dungeons. There's like 9 albums, so, which is not nothing. That's how I found it, and it works pretty well. But yeah, I think people are beginning to like kind of like discover this combination of elements, which works pretty well. Although, I just realized this is another April 1 release.
Yeah, it's stop doing it as April Fool's jokes. You're making good music.
Yeah.
Yeah. So just to give us a few track titles, I think the Astral Clock Tower is one that gets a little more dubby, and then Knights of the Forest Glade is more like driving synth, like through the back half of the album. Just if people want to like target listen to a few tracks, but I really think you should check out the whole album because I think the effect of that working together is pretty good.
Yeah, and it gets very like dubsteppy, like later on, like Haunted Clock Tower. In particular, it's like I'm listening back in my days when I listened to Skrillex. Don't hold that against this album. It's a good album.
Or do if you like Skrillex.
Yeah,
and I think some of the others were more interesting, but kind of in one way or another, sort of strayed a little too far from the fusion that I was looking for this episode. They're still good albums.
Yeah.
So we'll start with a single song, which I think you found just because it samples one of your favorite video games.
Yeah, I was just searching on YouTube for like dungeon. I was just using all these different terms: dungeon, breakcore, dungeon, drum and bass. Like anything plus dungeon. That was vaguely appropriate. So, and yeah, Chaos Within the Crimson Abyss, which has a lot of vocal samples and probably music samples from Darkest Dungeon.
Yeah, which is maybe one of the more dungeon synth video games. If people have never played it, it's gritty little I guess it's an RPG technically. Yeah,
it's like it's a
like
squad
a
based,
RPG.
Managing a whole multiple teams of dudes.
Yeah, and you send them into like dungeons and just hope as few of them die as possible.
Yeah, you can always recruit
bring
more
you back treasure.
Yeah, unless there's no
it's true. It's like FIFA Football Manager, but for like adventuring parties.
Yeah, with some XCOM elements in there too. But yeah,
yeah,
I've played a lot of it.
Yeah, it was very popular for a while. I don't know. The sequel never seemed to really hit with people as well.
They changed it too much, I think. It's like a journey, but you're stuck with the same people most of the time.
Oh, yeah. See, that's the whole point, is that you're like the boss and you're kind of the bad person.
Yeah,
because you're just exploiting all these these poor adventurers.
You need your weird little dudes. You need a lot of weird.
You need a lot of weird little dudes tough in them dungeons. So then, of course, it's not really an album worth talking about in the context of an episode because it's a mixtape, but I did like that Atmospheric Breaks mix that you posted that we were talking about earlier with Zelda, just to talk about the music. Mm-hmm. But I thought it was interesting in that I need to go maybe track down some of the artists I don't know, but it also is pulled from games and whatnot.
Yeah, there's a lot of those for that particular mix were remixes of like jungle or D&B remixes of songs from video game soundtracks. There's, again, that nostalgia cycle. Like, oh, remember this song from 20 years ago? All right, well, we reworked it.
Yeah. And then I guess just to shout out 2 other albums that I came across that I liked. Mm-hmm. These were found doing just combinations of tags in Bandcamp. So what is tagged as breakcore and dungeon synth or D&B and dungeon synth, etc. Mm-hmm. Sort of like you were talking about, just what are all these different search terms we can combine to find some fusion stuff. So one of them is Map of the Garden by Yotsuret Shidim and Dragon Maiden. Not an April 1st release, thankfully. It's an August 12th release. But I like, because it is, again, starts out a little more traditional dungeon synth, but has clearly some more modern synth elements in it, like arpeggiators, more mixing and effects.
Yeah, it's more like glitchy, like IDM type music, like Aphex sort of style of a dance music.
Yeah, or like track 2 has some like great big resonant bass drums going through it, like these big pounding. Just stood out as something that was, I consider like a blending of these genres. I thought did it pretty successfully, and pretty sure. Oh, it is tagged as Dungeon Step. I didn't notice that at the time because I found it through being tagged as Dungeon Synth and Breakcore.
Yeah,
that's how it came across.
Also tagged as Harsh Noise, which definitely.
Yeah, it's a little aggressive. It's a little gritty. Yeah. I don't think it's like that pure, like unlistenable noise.
Yeah,
so that's.
I respect you, Mooserbrow, but like, I can't.
You gotta be in a mood.
Yeah, you gotta be in a very certain mood.
You gotta be in a mood, but it definitely does have more of an experimental edge to it. Like the last track is a little more like liquidy and less like tonal and stuff. It really works.
Yeah.
And then the other album I guess we'll shout out is a Halftone Degradation by Odious, which is sort of did the same thing to me, where I think starts off as like, again, I'm repeating myself a lot, I guess, but because a lot of these albums have similar elements, I enjoyed in all of them. But it does start off a little bit more like, oh, this is, a Dungeon Synth album, and it gets almost into like dark ambient territory where it's like a lot of like skittering and just noise and soundscapes. But then into like track 2 has like a lot of these like staccato hi-hats. I call them trap drums. I think that term's becoming a little bit overused or passe, but that's what I think of when I hear the like really staccato fast bursts of hi-hats, like, like these little triplet bursts into big synth drums, bringing in more modern synth elements, but still keeping some of that dungeon synth tonality, which is, I think that is what spawned my original question of like, how much dungeon synth can you bring into like another genre and still convince the audience, or like not have the audience reject the dungeon synth side of the label?
Yeah.
Because there were a lot of albums that weren't bad, but that they were tagged as both, but I never really felt like they did both. Whereas I think the ones we highlight at least outright do both or get close enough for me.
I would agree. Halftone Degradation I did like because it's like dungeon synth as goth club music. It does have the dungeon synth, but then it goes into frenzy of like crunchy, like really big crunch, like industrial beats. Like which is not what I was expecting. And so I was like, oh yeah, okay, I can get into this.
I also just noticed it's tagged as unintelligent dance music.
Let's see. That's a fascinating tag.
That's a beautiful tag.
Oh, there's some other albums in this category.
I see a bulldog playing a saxophone.
Oh, maybe that's a future episode.
UDM.
Yeah, UDM. I just want to see
UDM.
What's the deal with UDM. Again, like maybe we're sort of like finding a trend that has yet to really fully emerge. It's still just kind of forming, but it just seems like an obvious route to fuse dungeon synth with like EDM music, because those are the biggest like synth driven genres, or some of them.
Yeah, or some little, it'd be interesting because a lot of these, yeah, that's the latest. Okay, well, one is from this year, which is the Buxkrug. But I noticed a lot of them were like 2022, so I don't know if there's something going on then also.
Yeah.
And then it unfortunately like never caught on, or maybe it's just a slow buildup. You know, there's that whole 3 or 4 years pre the real takeoff of like memification of vaporwave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where people were definitely doing vaporwave, but they didn't have like a name for it. Didn't quite know what they're doing. They're just making music they liked, which I think is first and foremost what all these people are doing. And that's what matters.
I mean,
and,
I think it's also like the changing nature of like what fantasy is, like how people view fantasy, because like,
sure,
it used to be fantasy was Lord of the Rings and Chronicles of Narnia, and like those are based on like folklore and Christian theology, and like now then we get pulp authors, and then we get D&D, and then we get video games, and now we get people who are just inspired by fucking video games. So it's like, again, this cultural evolution transition, as now we're getting like lit RPG novels and stuff like that, isekai stuff, but we're also getting like these different interpretations. Like I recently saw a trailer for a dungeon crawling, like a action RPG that was themed on surfing. You had like a little island, and you would surf to the other islands to fight monsters. So like you surf punk, literally called surf punk, like back 20 years ago, D&D, for 3rd edition reinvented itself as dungeon punk. Like that was the style, the artistic style of D&D that obviously influenced a lot of people. And then like now we're getting,
did it?
Yeah. I mean, that's the Pathfinder look in a nutshell, that Wayne Reynolds art.
I guess. Yeah. Because I always thought of the embarrassing like steampunk rebranding of like Eberron and all that.
Oh yeah. That was after that.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that was because Eberron was a pure third ed campaign setting.
Well, okay.
Yeah. So as what we think of what fantasy is, so does the music to evoke that changes. So I think we'll go from, we're already sort of going from the black metal side project, very atmospheric, very, square and sine wave based kind of music, to more complex interpretation. So yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to see this gradual evolution. There's a million other elements going in here, but like, it's just, has things changed in one area, they influence other areas. Big shocking revelation.
Yeah, and that's why people should just experiment and do whatever. That's why, going back to my point at the beginning, like when I talk about like, oh, you tagged your thing as Dungeon Synth and breakcore, and it didn't quite work as one or the other for me. That's just being descriptive. That's not saying those tags have to be prescriptive about what you make. That's just like as a listener and expectations.
Yeah.
So definitely get out there and try to make whatever weird little musical fusions pop in your brain, because it's all interesting to at least check out.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, because it does get, I do think people treat genre as like overly prescriptivist, and then if you like describe the wrong genre, expectations for the music sometimes can just sits weird because other people are talking about your art in a way that's different than you think about it. Mm-hmm. So I always try to say that we're trying to be as descriptive as possible, not prescriptive, not putting you in a box,
I'm eager to see all of these new interpretations. One thing I saw I didn't really have time to explore was there's chiptune, but now there's like dungeon chip, and so like dungeon chip, RPG themed chiptune music. Artists like Retro Goblin and Silent. Silent
check out too.
Yeah. There's that's a future episode, I guess. Is the dungeon?
Yeah,
chiptune,
and dungeon chip makes a little more sense because it does have that video game bridge that you've talked about, kind of bringing it together versus my sort of curiosity about looking in opposite directions. But I think to the last part of our typical broken record appeals at the end of these episodes is there's a ton of stuff out there. If we missed like obvious examples that you love, or you want to share examples, or a little bit about the history of some of these blendings of genres, we'd love to hear from you. So, please reach out, let us know. And if what we're talking about interests you, definitely check out the albums that are in the show notes. I recommend all of them to at least check out once.
so sweetly. A corpse should be left well alone.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed our Dungeon Synth dance party. Next episode, we're going to be doing our new musics August. So I have no idea what albums we're going to be talking about yet. I got to start looking at recent releases, maybe some Signal Wave. I feel like, I'm supposed to be using these new music episodes or else to talk about like new stuff I might not listen to. But there's also been a lot of really good Signal Wave. Yeah. And I might just cheat. I don't know. Just tune in next time to find out. But if you like this episode, you want to hear more of what we do have a Patreon, Nightclerk Radio at patreon.com. We have 40-some bonus episodes, a couple essays from Ross, some art, a really cool Discord community where you can talk about these types of topics. I've had some new people join. It's been great. It's not the biggest Discord out there, but I think we have a lot of really great discussions, even if sometimes I'm a little too busy and miss them. I think they're generally fun to go back and read. You can also find us pretty much anywhere on the socials at Nightclerk Radio. So, your Twitter, your X's, your Instagrams, your Blue Skies. Ross is on Blue Sky. I am not. We have nightclerkradio.com, nightclerkradio@gmail.com. If you just want to shoot an email into the void and wait until I remember to check that account and read it, that's also a possibility. Wherever you do check us out, just take a moment to hit that, what I call algorithmic signifier, the thumbs up, the like, whatever they call it, really does help, signal boost each episode and make a noticeable difference in sort of who we, reach and who gets to join our little community that we built over the past almost 5 years at this point, Ross.
Oh my God. Time keeps happening.
I know. I was thinking about that. I'm pulling the gun a little bit on the 5-year comment, but it's closer than I realized. So thank you so much for listening. We always advocate building community, talk to people about what you like. Hopefully what you like is maybe some Dungeon Synth dance party, and you can tell us about it. So until next time, bye.
Bye.